I just have a couple of housekeeping things I'd like to take care of before we start our program today. First and foremost is our cell phones. If we could please turn them off or put them on vibrate, it would be much appreciated. Secondly, in the rare event that we need to evacuate the building, I just wanted to make everyone aware of the exits. There's 4. There's an emergency exit over to my left, your right, near the kitchen. There's a second one here up in the corner to my left. And of course, the 2 exits are the doors that you came in from. So again, in the rare event, just please leave in an orderly fashion through those exits. Now on to our program. I would like to introduce Stephen Goldstein, who is the Director of Jewish Community Relations for the Council of Greater New Haven. Mr. Goldstein represents the Jewish Federation this morning, and the Federation, along with our own Yellow Candle Fund, are our partners in this annual event. I give you Mr. Goldstein.
Thank you, Gary, and thank you, Rabbi Wainhouse. I'm pleased to be joined here today by 2 other members of the Federation, our wonderful Mike Shanbram and Derek Holodek. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm representing Gail Schlossberg, our wonderful CEO. It has never been more important to remember Kristallnacht, and Rabbi Wainhouse's efforts in doing so have never been more important than today, 5785. This past week, never again was made a mockery in Amsterdam. As Kristallnacht approached, as the anniversary approached, Amsterdam became the site of a pogrom. Another Kristallnacht in the making. Every one of the shards of glass in Amsterdam represented a broken piece of our collective Jewish heart. What has the world learned since 1938? I'm sorry to tell you, not enough. And it will never be enough until every single Jew in this world can live without fear. And friends, the tolerance of anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism itself. I ask you today to bring your hearts, however broken, as is mine, to bear as they never have before. You see, we commemorate history not for the mere sake of memory, although Judaism teaches us the sacred value of Zachor. We remember history for the sake of never repeating it. We Jews today are the first responders to hatred. And although our hearts are broken, our hearts still work. Our voices still sing. Our souls are still Jewish, because even a broken crayon still knows how to color. I thank you on behalf of the Jewish Federation of Greater New Haven. I thank you, Rabbi Wainhouse, for this extraordinarily important program. And I thank the fantastic congregation at Or Shalom. You are truly an Or Shalom through the region and the nation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve, for those heartfelt remarks. Now, as we go on to our program, I'm going to turn the day over to our own Rabbi Wainhouse, who's been here 40 plus years and who has led this Kristallnacht program for, I think this is the 18th year. Every year it just is better and better. So I now give you Rabbi Wainhouse.
Welcome. Welcome to Greater New Haven's 18th Annual Kristallnacht Commemoration. Friends, our November gatherings these past 18 years have had two purposes, two distinct aims. Firstly, we've gathered to recall a catastrophe that occurred 86 years ago, known as Kristallnacht. The very word still fills us with anguish and dismay. Kristallnacht refers to the horrific events that took place just before the start of World War II on November 9th and 10th, 1938, in Nazi Germany and the parts of Europe that were already ruled by Nazism. In the course of those 2 nights, mobs rampaged through the streets of Germany, Austria, and Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia in a massive anti-Jewish attack planned and coordinated by the Nazi government. During those 2 nights, many people of the Jewish faith were murdered and maimed, and tens of thousands were dragged off to concentration camps. During that nightmare, thousands of Jewish-owned stores and businesses were ransacked and looted. And infamously, over hundreds, more than hundreds of synagogues, most of the Jewish houses of worship in the German sphere were torched and burned to the ground in full view of the police, who simply stood by and cheered. Fire companies were given explicit instructions to let the synagogues burn. Germans would later call those 2 nights, euphemistically, the nights of broken glass, Kristallnacht, referring to the shattered window panes and shards of stained glass that littered the streets in the aftermath of the horror. Friends, ultimately, as we know, Kristallnacht would end up shattering more than windows. The events of Kristallnacht turned out to be only the beginning, only a prelude to a much larger catastrophe that was about to shatter all of Europe, a catastrophe that came to be known as the Holocaust, the Shoah. At this time of Kristallnacht commemoration, therefore, we cannot help but remember that over the following 7 years, from 1938 until the end of World War II, approximately 6 million innocent Jewish men, women, and children, about 40% of the world's Jewish population, including all my aunts and uncles and cousins on my father's side, would be murdered, systematically slaughtered. At this time of Kristallnacht commemoration, we cannot help but remember that by 1945, European Judaism, the Jewish heartland and home of Yiddishkeit, Yiddish civilization, lay in ruins. And friends, at this time of Kristallnacht commemoration, we remember approximately 5 million innocent souls, gypsies, mentally disabled people, gay people, innocent men, women, and children who were branded by Nazi Germany as Untermenschen, subhuman, undesirable subhumans, and marked for death. But why observe Kristallnacht, the beginning of this appalling period in world history? Well, we do this because in the aftermath of Kristallnacht, in the aftermath of the barbaric events of those 2 days, the world was largely silent, speechless. The overwhelming majority of peace-loving people around the world simply assumed the evil would pass. It's a form of temporary madness, temporary lunacy, people would whisper. A momentary bout of insanity. It'll soon blow over. You'll see Germany, the birthplace of some of the world's greatest intellectual achievements, home to the world's finest universities and seats of learning, Germany will surely soon come to its senses, people insisted. But looking back in hindsight, we all know the truth. It was that very silence at the outset of the Holocaust, the very denial of evil, that gave Nazism permission, gave Germany a green light to proceed with its obscene plan. We gather at this time of the year, therefore, to remember that in the words of a great Irish philosopher, Edmund Burke, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. We gather every year to take that warning to heart and indeed to broadcast it. The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good people to do nothing. And thus, by extension, we come together not only to condemn the hate that gave rise to the catastrophe 86 years ago, but to condemn the hate that still exists today, now. Friends, in recent years, our commemoration of Kristallnacht has taken on even greater significance. For we find ourselves these days, sadly, living in a time of rising hate and rising bigotry. The Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, reports that the year 2024 saw a sharp increase globally in hate crimes aimed at minorities, minority groups, and as you know, among the groups targeted by bigots and racists here and around the world, members of the Jewish faith have been targeted like never before. Indeed, as Mr. Goldstein eloquently spoke, we're all still reeling. We're still reeling from the horrific acts of anti-Semitic violence perpetrated in the streets of Amsterdam a few days ago. Just last week, supporters of the Maccabi Tel Aviv soccer team were confronted by an anti-Jewish mob in a clearly, obviously coordinated, planned, organized attack in the streets of Amsterdam. Footage online, just look at the footage, shows fans being beaten by assailants using knives, clubs, and vehicles, and shouting, listen to the videos, "Run, Jews, run." We're outraged once again at such news, such reports, outraged that this happened to innocents who were only cheering for their team, outraged that hundreds of Jewish people were forced to scramble and hide once again, fearing for their lives yet again. Perhaps more urgently than ever, therefore, we've come together again this year to proclaim that although we and the world watched silently after Kristallnacht 1938, we will no longer be silent. We've come together because hate must not have the final word. Because hate will not have the final word. We open our commemoration this morning with the lighting of a flame and a word of prayer. At this time, I'll call upon Mr. Mitch Goldblatt, a prominent member of our men's club, to come forward and kindly light the Holocaust memorial candle. It was Mitch's dad, Mr. Barry Goldblatt, former member of Or Shalom. All of us Shalom, may he rest in peace, who originally designed this candle. Do you want to hold it up, Mitch, so that people can see it? It was then produced by the Federation of Men's Clubs of Conservative Judaism. The candle's color recalls the yellow Star of David the Nazi government forced us to wear, targeting our people for death. I'll ask you to kindly rise at this time as we light this candle of remembrance, the yellow candle. And let's pause for a moment of prayer, silent prayer. Baruch notea chaye olamim betochenu, beloved art thou, who taught us that our blessed deeds, our courageous acts of justice and loving kindness enable life to triumph over death. Let us say amen. Please join me now in an age-old prayer for peace. Let there be shalom. Ya'aseh shalom, Ya'aseh shalom, shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Ya'aseh shalom, Ya'aseh shalom, shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. Ya'aseh shalom, Ya'aseh shalom. V'al kol Yisrael, Ya'aseh shalom, Ya'aseh shalom, shalom aleinu, v'al kol Yisrael, v'al kol yoshvei tevel, v'imeru, amen. I invite you also in your prayers this morning to offer a personal prayer for innocents caught in the crossfire of war around the world. Ya'aseh shalom. Let's be seated. Mitch, would you say a couple of words at this time? This one's not working. I have to check it out.
Good morning, Rabbi, and good morning, everyone here. Thank you for being here for this momentous occasion. We thank Rabbi Wainhouse for his 18th celebration, commemoration of Kristallnacht. Just want to say that the men's club here at Or Shalom does sponsor a Yellow Candle program, as do conservative Judaism men's clubs throughout the entire world. And here we've been very successful in our program, successful enough to help sponsor this program today. We light the candle during Holocaust Remembrance Day, which coming up next year is April 23rd, the evening of April 23rd, 2025. Many of you receive yellow candles. If you don't, or don't think you do, see me afterwards. I'll gladly give you one, so you'll have one for April. But we do light it in memory and commemoration of the Shoah, the Holocaust, so that Zachor, we remember and never forget. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mitch. Friends, as I mentioned, we've gathered here every November for two reasons, two purposes that are different in spirit. The first is, of course, to commemorate the catastrophe, the Shoah, that began with Kristallnacht. But our second and perhaps more powerful motivation for gathering these past 18 years has been to remember that although some of the most unspeakable scenes in the annals of human history took place during World War II, it's also true that in the midst of the darkness, the moral darkness that descended upon Europe in that war, there were those who courageously chose to stand up to evil, chose to combat evil, rather than stand by and simply watch it happen. That is, there were those whose conscience impelled them to risk their lives, to save lives. Most of those heroes, the vast majority of them, were ordinary people who found themselves, often surprisingly, doing extraordinary things to save lives, even the lives of total strangers. At our annual Kristallnacht commemorations every year, we've highlighted and celebrated the conscience and courage of those brave souls. And in doing so, we've proclaimed their selfless acts will never be forgotten. In the midst of the darkness, they were beacons, brilliant beacons, reminding us to this day that there is still inconceivable goodness in the human heart. Such an important message to broadcast in this time of cynicism. Now, why do we do this here in a sanctuary? Why commemorate those blessed deeds in a house of God? Well, the answer, to my mind, is, in a word, in celebrating the acts of moral heroes here in God's sanctuary. We remind ourselves as to what religion is truly about, what religion was always about, what every great religion has been about, namely the quest for humanity, for higher humanity, the quest for what we call in Yiddish, Menschlichkeit, our highest selves. Which brings us to this morning's program. The highlight of this morning's program is a unique one. At our Kristallnacht gatherings year after year, we've celebrated the heroism of one, two, or even several rescuers who saved one, two, or even several lives during the Holocaust. But this morning we celebrate, unusually, the heroism of an entire people, an entire nation. A nation that 80 years ago, actually 81 years ago, did something no other country in Western Europe did. Today we celebrate Denmark's successful attempt to rescue its entire Jewish population. In 1943, there were approximately 7,800 members of the Jewish faith living in Denmark. And in October of that year, with the Nazi military regime breathing down their necks, the Danish people managed to save almost 100% of their fellow Jewish citizens from the death camps. This morning we'll retell the story of how, in a concerted effort, every segment of Danish society, Denmark's politicians, its police force, its army, its hospitals, its priests, its news media, its college students, and of course, unforgettably, its fishermen, especially Denmark's fishermen, came together, joined hands, and saw to it that the Holocaust would fail in their land, that at least in Denmark, the Holocaust would fail. Specifically, we'll celebrate the unparalleled role played by Denmark's king, King Christian X, Zichrono Livracha, may his memory be a blessing, in his nation's rescue effort. Indeed, Denmark's Consul General, Ambassador Meinertz, is with us this morning. Thank you so much, Ambassador Meinertz, from taking time from, I'm sure, a very busy schedule. She's here to receive a United States Senate Certificate of Special Recognition from Senator Richard Blumenthal on behalf of Denmark's Royal House. The certificate reads, "Presented in memory of King Christian X, who emboldened the Danish people to resist the Nazi occupation and rescue its Jewish community." That word, emboldened, was chosen because in truth, the values that led Denmark to resist the Holocaust were already embedded in Danish hearts. King Christian's leadership simply reminded his people as to who they are, who they were, and inspired his people to translate those values into action. So let's get started. Let's begin by asking, how? How did Denmark succeed in thwarting Nazi Germany's campaign of extermination? How did the Danish people pull this off? How did they prevent the ghettoization and deportation of its Jewish citizens? And what role did King Christian X play in this remarkable achievement? Well, at this point, I think it would be fitting to turn the pulpit over to someone who knows much more about this subject than I do. His name is Mr. Howard Weiss. It gives me great pleasure to introduce at this time a noted historian of the Danish rescue. In 2009, Howard Weiss left a litigation career and settled in Mystic, Connecticut, where he began to work as a volunteer at Mystic Seaport Museum's Preservation Shipyard. For more than a decade now, Mr. Weiss has been deeply involved at Mystic Seaport in preserving Gerda III, a leading boat in the fleet of boats that rescued Denmark's Jews. For more than a decade now, Mr. Weiss has been immersed in reconstructing the history of Gerda III and the people who used it to save lives. Toward that end, he traveled to Denmark to locate and meet with the family of those who carried out Gerda III's rescue missions. Mr. Weiss scoured Danish archives and visited the docks from which the rescue boats set out. Gerda III, by the way, is on permanent exhibit at Mystic Seaport. Anyone can see it. Please do see it. Mr. Weiss speaks regularly at the Mystic Seaport on the Danish rescue. And since he's regarded as an expert on the subject, he's invited around the country to speak about it as well. His book, Henny's Boat, which is the Gerda III, the maritime rescue operation that saved Denmark's Jews and sparked a nationwide revolt against the Nazis, is available online as well as at the Mystic Seaport Museum's bookstore and at the bookstore of the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York City, because the museum owns the boat. And speaking of the museum, Mr. Weiss was a consultant there on the museum's current exhibit titled, which opened on the 80th anniversary of the Danish rescue last year, The Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark. Please, if you're in New York, see the exhibit at the Jewish Museum. And now it gives me pleasure to call upon Howard Weiss. Welcome, Mr. Weiss. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Please. We welcome Mr. Weiss. I asked Mr. Weiss, what is your title? How shall I introduce you? Just say boat keeper. But you can see that his resume is much larger than that. But he does maintain the Gerda III at Mystic Seaport. Would you kindly shed light on the subject of the Danish rescue?
Thank you, Rabbi Wainhouse, and thank you all for coming to join us today. Within the horrific years that followed Kristallnacht were acts of humanity and heroism that lift us from despair and demonstrate people's ability to change the course of events, not merely be swept along by them. There's no greater example of that than World War II Denmark. The history of the righteous is often the story of individuals who mustered the courage to save Jews while people around them, infected by anti-Semitism, indifference, or simply afraid to act, became bystanders or worse. Today, in sharp contrast, we honor the Danish people and their wartime leaders for what they accomplished as a nation, united in opposition to anti-Semitism and in defense of their Jewish countrymen throughout 5.5 years of Nazi occupation. For the initial 3.5 years, Denmark stopped the Nazis from imposing any of the myriad measures that they imposed elsewhere to demonize Jews and to pave the way for the Holocaust. And when Danes could no longer protect their Jewish countrymen at home, they carried out an unprecedented maritime rescue in which, during a month of clandestine crossings spanning October 1943, they transported over 95% of Denmark's Jewish population to the safety of unoccupied Sweden. And when the Nazis were vanquished, the Danes welcomed back those that they had evacuated to homes that Christian neighbors and other Danes preserved for them during their exile. While each of these phases is exemplary, the maritime rescue operation most dramatically illustrates the Danes' readiness to defend the lives of their Jewish countrymen and the lengths to which they were prepared to go. Late one night in September 1943, 3.5 years after Nazi Germany invaded Denmark, a Danish political party leader learned of a Nazi plan to capture all of Denmark's Jews only 72 hours later on a Friday night during the High Holy Days. With no time to lose, he sprang into action, triggering a nationwide operation unlike any other. Against all odds, Danes in every walk of life joined forces to warn Jews that the Nazis were about to pounce, find them temporary hiding places within Denmark, and transport them across the body of water known as the Øresund to Sweden, the only unoccupied country within reach. In the final stages of that rescue, 300 boats manned by roughly 1,000 Danish mariners, supported by tens of thousands of Danes on shore, rescued by the latest Swedish counts 7,742 Jews and another 650 loved ones of other faiths. The story begins in April 1940, 7 months after the start of World War II, when Danes awoke to a land, sea, and air invasion, and with German bombers circling over Copenhagen, warships along its shores, troops and tanks streaming across its borders, Denmark was forced to surrender in a matter of hours, but not unconditionally. Germany secured key objectives, among them fortifying Denmark's coast against a possible D-Day invasion on Germany's doorstep, transforming all of Denmark into a militarized buffer zone. But Denmark also obtained something that proved vitally important and surprisingly durable, written assurance that it would retain political independence, which to it meant control over its internal affairs. With that assurance in place, an icy coexistence set in for several years. Denmark's government continued to function. The hallmarks of its democracy, its elected parliament, and impartial judiciary carried on. And the Danish people, Jews and non-Jews alike, were insulated from Nazi interference with their lives and property. The terms of the truce and the Danes' ongoing refusal to yield any ground on the status of its Jewish countrymen made it possible for Danish Jews to maintain their normal routines, the semblance of normal life, even as Jews elsewhere were being deported and sent to their deaths. But with the ever-escalating persecution of Jews across the border in Nazi Germany and throughout the rest of occupied Europe, it became increasingly clear to the Danish Jews and the rest of Denmark that their freedom and very probably their lives rested on Denmark's continued commitment and ability to protect them. Year after year, that resolve was put to the test as the Nazis pressured Denmark's government to take actions that would deprive Jewish countrymen of their liberties and pave the way for their removal. But whenever the Nazis pushed Denmark to degrade Jewish life, Denmark's government and people pushed back, refusing to yield an inch. Although the hopelessness of a military response remained clear, the government and the Danish people found the power to resist in other ways. By presenting a firm and united front on the part of Denmark's king and parliament, leaving no weak points within the government for the Nazis to exploit. By presenting the very real threat of a nationwide uprising against the occupation forces if lesser measures failed to protect Jewish countrymen. And by making clear that Nazi efforts to divide the Danish people would be met with a greater showing of solidarity, a showing which the king was visibly prepared to lead. All of this, however, could only hold the tide back for so long. As Hitler's plans for a Jew-free Europe proceeded elsewhere, and his goals seemed within reach, the Nazis increased pressure on Denmark to fall in line. By the start of 1943, disputes over the fate of Denmark's Jews had become a cause of great friction, but not the only one. Throughout Denmark, there was a growing weariness of occupation and an uptick in resistance activity, culminating in the bombing in August 1943 of an exhibition hall that was being ready to house another 2,000 German troops, scheduled to arrive the following day. When the Danish government rejected Nazi demands to capture and execute the saboteurs, the Nazis declared martial law, sweeping away Denmark's legitimate government and putting Nazi overlords in control. As one of the first steps, the head of that new regime telegraphed Berlin, measures should now be taken toward a solution of the problem of the Jews. And a typically ruthless plan was put into operation. Occupation forces stole names and addresses of Jews from Jewish community offices to provide quite literally a roadmap for the Gestapo to follow. Gestapo agents and trucks were sent in to round up Denmark's Jews late on a Friday night into early Saturday morning, and 2 troop ships were sent to Copenhagen to begin their transport to the concentration camps. In any other occupied country, all of this would have gone according to plan. But in Denmark, the Nazis came up almost empty-handed. They captured 202 Jews in Copenhagen, mostly elderly, and 82 in the rest of Denmark, while nearly 8,000 others had found temporary shelter. For the Gestapo, it was an unprecedented failure. For the Jews, a temporary reprieve. With the Gestapo still in hot pursuit, no place in Denmark could be safe for very long. Unoccupied Sweden was the only place where they could safely remain beyond Hitler's reach, and the only way to get there was by boat. Before the weekend had ended, a massive maritime evacuation was already getting underway in harbors all along the Øresund coast, all along the strait that separates Denmark from Sweden. From high overhead, the scope of the operation and the speed with which it got underway would have given the appearance of a magnificently organized event. But it was actually hundreds of individual efforts, begun by boat owners, captains, crew members, or people who set out to recruit them. One boat in particular drew me into the story more than a decade ago. As Rabbi Wainhouse mentioned, as a Mystic volunteer, I took on a lead role in maintaining the Danish rescue boat Gerda III and became its de facto historian. Acquired by the Museum of Jewish Heritage as a gift from the Danish government, thank you, Ambassador, and long displayed on its behalf in Mystic Seaport, Gerda III is one of only 3 Danish rescue boats known to remain afloat and was one of the most successful. Throughout the occupation of Denmark, it served as a lifeboat for persons hunted by the Nazis, saving at least 300 Jews, 10 to 15 on each passage during its month-long Jewish rescue operation, and saving 600 other Nazi targets during the rest of the war. Danish resistors who had been discovered and Allied airmen whose warplanes were too badly damaged to make it back to their bases. In this first picture, already up, you see Gerda in its home waters, and conditions that were typical of the rescue period, conditions during that period sometimes being rougher than that. And a few months afterwards, in its wartime trim. And then in the next photo, on a foggy day at Mystic Seaport, evoking the clandestine rescue operation back in Denmark, and again at Mystic in sunlit glory. It's a nearly century-old boat that we're striving to save and return to sound operating condition so that new generations can learn from and be inspired by it, a mission as important today as ever. Boats are portals to the past, powerful links to the persons who strode the decks and, in this case, huddled below deck in their desperate escape from the Nazis. Gerda III is all that and more. The story of Gerda III's rescue missions conveys a strong sense of the life-saving efforts that took place in every Danish harbor from which boats could reach Sweden and at innumerable rendezvous places along the Danish shore from which Jews could wade out to fishing boats and other rescue craft. It was Gerda's 4-man crew that initiated its involvement in the rescue. The people you see there on Gerda's deck, and again in this picture, they were among the few who already had some experience with rescue missions. Gerda III was a lighthouse tender built to bring supplies and crew changes to a large Danish lighthouse. Prior to the Jewish rescue operation, an early resistance group led by 2 sons of the lighthouse keeper turned to Gerda III to evacuate members of that group when they had to escape. And in those early days, Gerda III would take resistors as far as the lighthouse, where they would wait for colleagues from Sweden to come and take them the rest of the way. A method that worked until the lighthouse was itself occupied and transformed into a Nazi observation post. But for the Jewish rescue, the crew needed to go further, all the way to Sweden. They needed to go every day, not just occasionally. They needed to reposition the boat from the royal dockyards, where it was now surrounded by German warships, to a place more feasible to bring Jews on board. And they needed a way to make contact with Jews already in hiding. For all of this, the crew turned for help to 22-year-old Henny Sindig, who was an employee of the lighthouse and buoy service, which owned and operated Gerda, and was the daughter of its commander. She threw herself in completely, without a moment's hesitation. Here, you see Henny before the need for the rescue upended her life. And in the next photo, a few months after the Jewish rescue operation, shown here with Mix, a young Navy cadet who rapidly became a key member of the rescue group and simultaneously the great love of her life. With her father's help, Henny repositioned the boat behind a waterfront warehouse located a short distance from the heart of Copenhagen, across a bridge, easily passed on foot or by bike. When you see there, the warehouse had an attic where Henny hid the next day's passengers each night, as many Jews as they could fit aboard the boat the following morning. It had a gate that faced the wharf where Gerda docked, as you can see there. She found homeowners near the warehouse who were willing to hide Jews for days at a time while they waited to take the next steps to the warehouse attic and the boat. And to bridge the gap between this escape route and the Jews who needed it, she joined forces with Mix and 8 other members of a college resistance group of which she had become a part. They were perfect partners. Mainly medical students, they had ties to a large hospital complex in Copenhagen that spread the word that Jews who could reach the facility would be hidden first in patient beds with fictitious names and charts, and then when those overflowed, as they did in the first day, in staff quarters, while doctors connected them with rescue craft and arranged transportation to rendezvous points, often using the hospital's own ambulances to move them along. And because this group that Henny bonded with were members of the underground press prior to the rescue, they had ties to a Copenhagen bookstore that was first a center for the underground press, and then another center for connecting refugees with boats. Each day, members of the group gave Henny lists that she had to memorize with names of refugees and places to meet them. As she put it, it was arranged for each refugee accompanied by no more than one child, to show up at a certain time and place. Henny would first escort them to the private homes near the attic where they awaited the next steps. And then at 1 a.m. each morning, after conferring with the crew and determining how many people they could fit aboard the next day, she would go out well after curfew and just being on the street for anything was dangerous, and picked up the refugees one at a time and brought them to the attic. The refugees she encountered spent the night in the warehouse attic as quiet as mice. The worst time was when we had many children, not to mention infants. We always carried a jar of sleeping pills, and almost every night it was necessary to quiet some children with a pill to get some calm in the group. Food was taken care of. There was always something to eat and drink for our guests in the attic, but no one could eat. We all had a bad case of stomach ache, and the night seemed endlessly long, both for the refugees and the 5 of us, Henny and the 4 crew members. Aaron Engelhart, a 14-year-old boy who escaped on Gerda with his parents and 4 younger siblings, gave a rich account of what came next and a refugee's perspective of the whole rescue operation. His family's escape started during dinner in their Copenhagen apartment, when their building manager knocked on the door to warn them that the Nazis were coming and to offer shelter in her own apartment for their first night as a hunted family. The next day, they split up and found shelter in 4 different homes, until word reached Aaron's father that doctors at the hospital were organizing escape routes to Sweden. As instructed, Aaron's father collected the family and headed to the hospital chapel. From there, they were led through underground passages to an auditorium where hundreds of Jews were already waiting. For a few nights, they were hidden in nurses' quarters, then taken by ambulances to rendezvous points where Henny awaited. Echoing Henny's accounts, Aaron recalled that the crew boarded Gerda in the earliest pre-dawn hour that they could appear to be readying the boat for its regular job. And at the same time, Henny led the Jews from the warehouse attic down to the ground floor, where she lined them up in rows behind a gate that opened up facing Gerda. And there in front of them, just a few meters away across a cobblestone lane, was a boat in which they pinned all their hopes of getting out alive. Depending on where you were in the month of October, the first real feeling in days or perhaps weeks that they could get out of this. And yet, between them and the boat, one further obstacle that they had to get past, 2 German military sentries who marched on the dock, actually crisscrossing right in front of Gerda, going out to the ends of the dock, turning a corner briefly on one side and coming back. From Gerda 3's deck, the crew watched the sentries as well, waiting for the moment when the chance to cross was as good as it was going to get. And when that moment arrived, they signaled Henny, and in that instant, she would propel the next person forward to dash across the cobblestone lane between the warehouse and the boat into the hands of a waiting crewman who would lift them over the rail and immediately jammed them into the cargo hold, a 12 by 10-foot space, like you see here, without the cargo, barrels of oil and such, that would fill much of the space at the time of the rescue. When all the others were on board, Henny ran across the lane with children who were too young and too heavily sedated to run across the cobblestones, past them into the hands of a waiting crew member who would lower them into the hands of whoever was closest to the open hatch. Aaron recalled that as he sat under the opening, a baby was handed to me directly under the hatch. I cradled it so that it would calm down. The refugees sat in the recesses of the cargo hold, backs braced against the sides of the vessel. The hatch covers were put in place over them, leaving them in darkness, and then the hatch covers covered with as much heavy gear as possible to discourage searches. There they silently awaited the authorized 7 a.m. departure, holding their breath as the sentries came aboard each morning for a cursory inspection, listening to the sound of their army boots on the wooden deck inches above the refugees' heads. Finally, the sentries departed, the dock lines were cast off, and the boat headed to sea, traveling distances of 14 to 25 miles to whichever Swedish harbor the crew thought safest on that particular day. Passages of 2 to 3.5 hours in calm seas, longer in the rough weather that existed during much of the rescue period. From inside the warehouse, Henny watched the boat depart before going home for a few hours of sleep and starting the process anew, day after day, for a month. Some rescue boats operated similarly, but many others, based in smaller harbors where they could be easily observed and intercepted, adopted the practice of meeting Jews outside of port, along shorelines from which they could wade out and be lifted aboard. Professor Leo Goldberger and his family. Leo was 13 at the time of in this way. He recounted in a wonderful book that he had put together on this subject that his family was guided by Christian rescuers to a beach a few miles south of Copenhagen, bushes waiting for a light signal from a boat offshore, and that when it appeared, they had to wade out 100 feet through icy water that reached his chest, while his father waded out with his 2 younger brothers in his father's arms. Reaching the boat, they were lifted aboard by a fisherman who Professor Goldberger described as a courageous and noble soul, and were directed in whispers to lie concealed in the cargo area with some 21 other Jews. As they headed toward open sea, Leo recounted his father, the cantor of the synagogue, chanted a muted prayer from the Psalms. And each time I read that, I reflect on the fact that the single biggest day of the rescue operation, a day when over 1,000 Jews were transported to Sweden, was Yom Kippur. And how on that day, when people say the traditional prayer to be inscribed in the Book of Life, how many said that prayer, and hundreds of boats spread over the length and worsened. By different routes, Aaron and Leo arrived in much the same place, to much the same welcome. Here, you could see them both. Aaron, I believe, last row second from right, and Leo, I believe, last row in the left. In a class picture in a school in Sweden, attended and taught by Danish exiles, a small sample of the thousands of lives saved. The great success of the rescue can't obscure the fact that this was dangerous business. Among the early warnings, a boat with 19 Jews on board was perforated by gunfire as it attempted to leave port on the first day of the rescue, its occupants forced to jump overboard, captured as they swam ashore. The crews of 8 fishing boats returning from taking Jews to Sweden were captured and sent to a Nazi prison where another prisoner reported on their brutal treatment. A rescuer was shot dead on a dock as he cast off dock lines, and a boat operating in the same area hit a mine and exploded. 190 Jews were captured in failed rescue attempts. The rescue succeeded not because it was easy, but because the Nazis never experienced and were unprepared for anything like it. There were far more rescue boats from far more starting points than the Nazis could control, far more rescuers on land that the Nazis could capture. And there was a spike in sabotage attacks by a surging resistance movement that diverted the Nazis from chasing Jews to defending their supply lines. Armed resistance continued to soar after the October rescue, to a significant degree because of it. For Henny and her colleagues, banding together to rescue the Jews, finding colleagues they could trust, finding out what they had within themselves, and finding out that they could take on the Nazis and prevail, was a turning point from which there could be no going back. And so for 4 months following the rescue, Henny, Mix, and their college student colleagues became a potent part of the invigorated resistance, blowing up 22 major industrial sites that had been converted to making war equipment for the Nazis, going bigger and bolder until one raid, too bold, resulted in the deaths of 2, the captures of a few others, and the evacuation of Henny and Mix using techniques they had developed months earlier to save the Jews. At the seaport, I often speak with visitors about the Danish rescue as I work on Goethe. After one discussion with an Orthodox family, I heard a young daughter ask her mother as they left the dock, were the people who owned the boat Jewish? And when her mother correctly answered no, the girl answered the expected follow-up question. Then why did they help the Jews? It's a question that goes to the heart of the story, and it's one to which Henny had the perfect answer. When she was asked what motivated her, she replied, "We never divided ourselves up into Danes or Jews. The Jews were just Danes like we were. And the Nazis' attack on the Jews was therefore an attack on our Danish people," one, she said, that made her furious. Her answer reflects a national ethos that was deeply embedded in Danish culture long before the crisis arose, as it had to be for so many to mobilize so quickly and with such determination. If in the moment of crisis, Christian Danes had to first ponder their relationship to Jewish countrymen and their own duties as citizens, the rescue could never have succeeded within the hours they had to act. It succeeded because while so many other cultures kept ancient prejudices simmering beneath the surface, waiting to be fanned into a conflagration by the next charismatic hate monger to come along, Denmark did the opposite. Its leaders and institutions, government, churches, schools, had for generations actively instilled and nurtured the realization that hate mongering is not just a danger to its intended targets, but to the survival of a democratic society, the express rationale for hate crime legislation that Denmark enacted in the aftermath of Kristallnacht. That bigotry must be fought when it first appears, because each small assault on the dignity and rights of others paves the way for a greater one, leading to what was once unimaginable. And that citizenship entails not just rights, but responsibilities, including a responsibility to rise to the defense of countrymen threatened by anti-Semitism and other forms of discrimination. The rise of Hitler and his Nazi ideology in adjacent Germany, followed by the Nazi invasion in Denmark, tested whether these beliefs could endure the torrents of hate speech that followed and the escalation of anti-Semitic acts in neighboring lands. But the Danish people stood firm, buttressed in large measure, as you're about to hear, by the moral and resolute example of their king, a steadfast friend and defender of Denmark's Jews who never left his people and never bowed to Nazi pressure.
Thank you so much, Howard. Years ago, an attendee at one of our Kristallnacht gatherings mentioned, "You know, I think what you're focusing on, Rabbi Wainhouse, is the mystery of goodness. We think so long and hard and ponder the mystery of evil and how the human being can sink to such low depths. But Rabbi Wainhouse, it seems like every year you focus on the mystery of goodness, of human goodness, and there's a lot of truth to that. And thank you so much, Howard, for bringing that out. Which brings us to the specific topic, our specific topic this morning. the role of King Christian X in the Danish rescue now comes into focus. Now, in his talk, Mr. Weiss touched on various theories that attempt to explain. At the end of his talk, he spoke about various theories which attempt to explain why Denmark's wartime history was so different, so unique. But all historians all agree that the example set by Denmark's leaders, specifically the example set by King Christian X of blessed memory, were critical to the success of Denmark's astounding rescue operation. Without that example, without the role modeling of Denmark's leaders, especially the role modeling of King Christian X, the Danish miracle would probably not have happened. You know, in Jerusalem, on Jerusalem's Mount of Remembrance, there's a beautiful grove of trees called the Garden of the Righteous. Gan Chasidei Umot Ha'olam, the Garden of the Righteous, is meant to honor those not of the Jewish faith who courageously risked their safety and their lives to save members of the Jewish faith during the war. The garden is part of Yad Vashem, Israel's memorial to the victims of the Holocaust. Every rescuer, as well as the one who bravely rescued my father, Alav Hashalom, may he rest in peace, is honored with a tree in that garden. The thousands of trees in the garden were all planted there for that purpose, to honor the rescuers. Now, in the Garden of the Righteous, you'll find that Denmark's astounding achievement has been honored not by one tree, which would have been typical, but by 3 trees. You'll find 3 trees in the Garden of Remembrance, the Garden of the Righteous. And they're adjacent to each other. And the plaque under those trees explains, 1 tree has been planted for the Danish people. 1 tree has been planted for the Danish underground resistance, which rescued their fellow Jewish citizens. And a 3rd tree has been planted for King Christian X, who emboldened his people to resist Nazism. So let's get into this. What exactly did King Christian do to deserve such recognition by Yad Vashem? Well, we get our first glimpse of the king's step in this direction on April 9th, 1940, one of the darkest days in Danish history. It was the day when Germany's bombers flew over Denmark, its next-door neighbor, when German tanks rolled into Denmark and occupied Copenhagen, the capital. And it was on that day, that very day, that King Christian faced an existential dilemma. Should I leave with my family and go into exile? Should I flee the country, as the king of Norway was about to do, the queen of Holland was about to do, the king of Greece was about to do, the king of Yugoslavia would soon do, and so on and so on and so on. You see, pretty much all of King Christian's fellow rulers fled when the Nazi armies overran their lands, but not King Christian X. The king and his family chose to remain in Denmark under Nazi rule as a visible symbol of national identity. And this choice by the king to remain with his people instantly became a source of great Danish national inspiration and encouragement. But King Christian went beyond simply choosing to live in the Danish capital. He went far beyond this. You see, the king felt it was not enough to simply spend the war in the comfort and safety of his castle. King Christian X believed it was necessary to visibly demonstrate his defiance of the Nazi regime. In fact, he felt he needed to become a role model of defiance for his people, and thus the king insisted on taking daily rides every morning on horseback through the streets of Copenhagen, deliberately unguarded, deliberately unprotected, while continuously saluting his people. You can see this on video. He's doing this continuously because His people are saluting back. And if a Nazi soldier on patrol happened to salute the king, why, the king would refuse to return the salute. This daily spectacle proved to be hugely uplifting to the Danish people. And they would wait for him at Copenhagen's street corners in order to applaud and cheer and flock around their riding king. In fact, look at the cover of the handout. Look at that picture. That was a very typical scene. Let me see if I can find this. King Christian X's decision to remain with his people under Nazi rule rather than go into exile became a source of great national pride. His daily rides on horseback, completely unprotected, were an especially inspiring sight. In fact, this scene inspired a popular Danish folk song entitled, "There Rides a King, There Rides Our King." Look at your handout, the program, and look at the back of the program. When I went abroad, they asked me, "How does your king dare to ride alone, unguarded?" I answered, "Why, he never rides alone. Although unprotected by might or brawn, it is our hearts that protect our king." And see also the photo of Professor Leo Goldberger, who is wonderfully with us this day. Look at the picture I took of Professor Goldberger on the back of the handout. Professor Emeritus Leo Goldberger was ferried from Denmark to safety in Sweden when he was 14 years old. Like many Danes, his family proudly displayed a statuette of their riding king, King Christian X. When I visited Professor Goldberger, can I call you Leo? Aryaleib. Aryaleib is your Jewish name. We've conducted an ongoing conversation in Yiddish. He's a yeshiva boy like me. He went to yeshiva in Baltimore. I went to one in Brooklyn. And so as we were schmoozing, I saw that statuette, the figurine. I know it's in your room. And so I said, "Can I take a picture of?" And look at the pride on his face. Look at the pride on his face. Many, many, many Danish families displayed that riding king. But friends, this was only the beginning of King Christian's resistance to the Nazi regime. Bo Lidegaard, Dr. Bo Lidegaard, is the editor-in-chief of Denmark's leading newspaper. He's also a Danish historian of note. Dr. Lidegaard, in 2013, wrote a groundbreaking book titled Countrymen: The Untold Story of How Denmark's Jews Escaped the Nazis. And he opens his book with these words, which I've adapted for the purpose of my presentation. It was September of 1941. Germany was in control of most of Europe. Indeed, Germany's advance into Russia seemed unstoppable. The news was going from bad to worse. And it was at this point that the acting head of the Danish government came to the king to discuss the delicate issue of Denmark's Jews. Mr. Lidegaard cites the following entry in the king's personal diary on that day in September, that dark time, September 1941, which has only been recently published. Look at your handout. Look at the front of the handout. This is the entry the king made in his diary. Our acting head of state has just approached me with a deep concern. He asked, considering Germany's inhuman treatment of Jewish people in Germany and countries under German occupation, Your Majesty, one cannot help but worry that one day this will happen here in Denmark. I replied to the head of state, well, I will not consent to it. If it happens, we must refuse to cooperate. And if necessary, we will all wear the Star of David. That's in his diary. And Dr. Lidegaard then continues and comments, the head of state certainly did not even try to keep the king's words to himself. His conversation with the king led to newspaper reports of the king's remark, which in turn led to a famous political cartoon in a newspaper portraying the king as saying those very words. There's no indication whatsoever that the king even cautioned the Danish head of state about going public with this remark. It seems pretty clear the king wanted, in this indirect way, for the Nazi regime to know he was prepared to wear the yellow star, used by the Nazi regime to target Jews for death. And this, the king's readiness to wear the yellow star, finally led to a myth, which many of you believe to be true, but it's a myth. The myth that the king and all his subjects actually did wear a yellow Star of David, not true. It's a myth. The myth is false, of course. The king never wore a yellow star because, in fact, Danish Jews were never compelled to wear a yellow star. And why? As Lidegaard explains, and as Howard Wise elucidates, in a rare instance of the truth being better than the myth, it became clear to the Nazi authorities that imposing the yellow star in Denmark would simply backfire, would boomerang. It became clear to the Germans that the king was determined to turn the yellow star into a demonstration of unity between Christians and Jews. Hence, no member of the Jewish faith was ever made to wear the yellow star in Denmark. The truth was better than the myth. But King Christian's defiance did not stop there. In 1942, the head of state's premonition, dark premonition, was becoming a daily reality in the streets of Copenhagen. The Jews of Denmark were now beginning to experience increasing anti-Semitic violence. The most infamous of these acts of violence was the attack on Copenhagen's Great Synagogue, one of the most beautiful synagogues in all of Europe. In December 1941, the Great Synagogue of Copenhagen was struck in an arson attack. The king, dismayed, decided to write a public letter of sympathy to the rabbi of the Great Synagogue, although King Christian's advisors strongly recommended that he not irritate the Nazi administrator of Denmark in this way. The king went ahead against the advice of his counselors and wrote the letter, a public letter of sympathy. Think about that. Think about it. 3 years after Hitler burned down every synagogue in Germany on Kristallnacht, King Christian writes a sympathy letter, a public sympathy letter to the Jewish community in the aftermath of the arson attack on the synagogue. And on top of that, in the midst of the German occupation, the Nazi perpetrators who attempted to burn down the synagogue were caught by the Danish police and sentenced to imprisonment with the king's blessing. I'm told the king's sympathy letter still hangs in the Great Synagogue's lobby. And now we arrive at the climax of the king's defiance. By the fall of 1942, growing Danish anger and bitterness about the Nazi occupation began to lead to acts of anti-Nazi sabotage against the German military occupation carried out by the Danish underground. Well, by the summer of 1943, acts of sabotage against the Nazi military had escalated to unprecedented heights, which led the exasperated Nazi administrator of Denmark to impose a curfew on Danish citizens, to censor the Danish press, and to forbid public gatherings throughout Denmark. Over the summer of 1943, tension between Germany and Denmark continued to grow. By late August 1943, the tension between the Nazi regime and the Danish government had reached a boiling point. On August 28, 1943, the Nazi administrator delivered an ultimatum to the Danish government, namely, arrest and execute anti-Nazi saboteurs at once. The majority of the Danish government rejected this demand, refusing to act against its own citizens. Indeed, King Christian went ahead and publicly congratulated the members of parliament for their principled stand against the German demand. And 24 hours later, with support from the king, the Danish government chose to resign rather than give in to the German ultimatum. And so on August 29th, 1943, the Nazi regime declared a state of emergency. Sweeping the Danish government aside, the Nazi administrator imposed martial law and seized total control of Denmark and immediately placed King Christian X under arrest. And now with Nazi Germany in full control of Denmark, on September 8th, 1943, the Nazi administrator of occupied Denmark decided the time has come at last for the final solution to the Jewish problem of Denmark. A plan was hatched, as we know, by the Nazi military regime to capture Denmark's entire Jewish community, as you heard, during Rosh Hashanah, when families would be together, October 1st and 2nd, 1943, and to deport the entire Jewish population to concentration camps on Rosh Hashanah. But on September 30th, King Christian got wind of this plan, got wind of the Nazi deportation plan. And while under house arrest, King Christian immediately sent the Nazi administrator a public protest, a strong protest against the deportation order, threatening, this is the king under house arrest, such measures against a group of people who are our own citizens. I get goosebumps whenever I read this. Our own citizens will have the most serious consequences, he threatened the German authorities. The United States Holocaust Memorial and Museum recounts that although the king's firm objection had no effect on Germany's plan to deport the Jewish population, it succeeded marvelously in emboldening the Danish people to resist when they heard the king's objection. And so, warned by the Danish resistance of Germany's plans, Jews spent Rosh Hashanah 1943 not in shul, not in synagogue, but in churches, in local churches, hiding, and in local hospitals, hiding, and in neighbors' homes, hiding. And it was at that point that, as we know, the Danish resistance helped to transport over 7,000 Jews by train, by car, on foot, to fishing ports along the Danish shoreline. Within a few weeks, Denmark's fishermen, those were all heroes. Those faces were all amazing heroes. Fishermen rescued almost 100% of Danish Jewry to safety across the Sound, across the narrow body of water separating Denmark from Sweden. In fact, look at the artistic, Fran, would you hit the lights, please, Fran? Look at the artistic, this is a great artistic rendition of Henny. This has got to be Henny, right? This has got to be Henny rescuing, oh, let me turn to it. That's Henny. And that's Gerda 3. Don't know if you can read it, but you'll see it in your handout. Look at your handout. on page 3. Rendition of the Danish Rescue for the Courage to Act exhibition at New York's Museum of Jewish Heritage. The exhibition opened in 2023, October, on the occasion of the rescue's 80th anniversary. Yeah, great artistic rendition. As a result, the Holocaust failed in Denmark. World War II came to an end on May 5th, 1945, and the Danish escapees to Sweden returned to find, amazingly, that their apartments and homes had been guarded and cared for by their Danish neighbors. Even the plants were watered by their Danish neighbors. After the war, the Jewish community sent a telegram to King Christian. The representatives of the Jewish community of Denmark. I also get goosebumps and I become a little tearful when I read these words. Send His Majesty, this is after the war, their greeting on the liberation of Denmark, together with our expression of profound thanks for the unforgettable efforts of His Majesty on behalf of the Jews of Denmark. The king replied, I give you my heartfelt thanks. I give you all my heartfelt thanks. And the king ended his message with 2 words, perhaps prophetically, just 2 words, au revoir. He passed away 2 years later. Zichrono livracha, may his memory bring blessing, and let us say amen. Friends, the time has come to introduce Senator Richard Blumenthal, who will say a few words on this occasion. Did you bring the certificate? Yes, you did. He will present a certificate. I have one just in case. I have one. Rhett is an amazing assistant, Rhett Huskinson. And he will present this certificate in memory of King Christian X, as you know. Senator Blumenthal has served as the U.S. Senator from the state of Connecticut since 2011, and this is the 18th consecutive year of his participation in our Kristallnacht commemorations. Senator, I was standing near the Gerda 3 with Mr. Vise a couple of weeks ago. The boatkeeper, Mr. Vise. Recently, when a young couple from Missouri approached the boat to visit the boat. Well, I got to talking about this morning's event, and I invited them to this morning event, but they said, we're going back to Missouri in a couple of days. I told the couple from Missouri that you'd be here today, Senator. What? They shouted, Senator Blumenthal is going to be there? We love Senator Blumenthal. So you have, am I exaggerating, Howard? Come on, Howard. So you've got at least 2 fans in Missouri. Anyway, they're back in Missouri, but I promised I'd send them I send you their fond regards. I give you Senator Richard Blumenthal.
Thank you, Rabbi, for that wonderful introduction. I won't respond to it, but it is wonderful to be back. 18 is, it's not a lot of years, and every one of these ceremonies has been just profoundly moving and significant. So I'm really honored and excited to be back. And yes, I do have a certificate. I was instructed to bring a certificate, even though we had sent a certificate. So there are 2 of them now. The rabbi leaves nothing to chance. But I thank him, and I thank this wonderful congregation for this occasion. I don't know of anything like it in the state of Connecticut or in the country, for that matter, but it's an occasion that reminds us, as he put it so well, of the mystery of good as well as the mystery of evil. And in a lot of ways reaffirms, for me at least, the importance of good, and nothing good happens without people standing up, speaking out, acting, as well as talking. And so we celebrate today another heroic actor, a man of profoundly important history to Jews, but to all of humanity. And I'm honored to share this podium with Leo Goldberger and Howard Weitz and Peter Armstrong of the Mystic Seaport Museum, three extraordinarily distinguished speakers and actors in celebration of a man, but really it's of a people, because King Christian X inspired people to heroic actions. As I was reading about King Christian, and every time we have these occasions, it leads me to read about the background and learn a lot in the process. I thought about a trip that I recently took to Normandy on the 80th anniversary of D-Day. I led a delegation of 20 senators, 20 of my colleagues, evenly divided Republican and Democrat, for the ceremonies honoring that 80th anniversary of D-Day. And the speeches were moving, Biden, Macron, Zelensky, but what struck me most and moved me most was the veterans who were there, Americans who had landed on that day at Omaha Beach 80 years ago. They're all now, of course, in their hundreds. The average age is 100. And listening to them tell me their stories of that day was really very powerful. One of them said to me, "That was our moment." 80 years ago, that was our moment. And I walked through the American Cemetery. I'm sure many of you have been there, you've seen pictures, the markers, white, silently eloquent markers in the cemetery, and then down to Omaha Beach, which is 3 football fields long. It's not like Hammonasset Beach. It's 3 football fields long, and it is absolutely flat. There are no trees, there are no dunes, there is no cover. And I thought of those boys. They were 19, 20 years old at the time. Most had never been away from home. Landing that day in 8 feet of water with 70 pounds on their backs under a hail of mortar fire, machine guns from the Germans up on the cliff. 90% were killed in the first wave, 80% in the second wave. And they kept going. They fought through the beach, over the cliffs. They pushed back the Germans. They liberated Europe. They preserved democracy. That was their moment. And I thought to myself on that beach, thinking of them and their courage and strength, we all have a moment. We all have a moment when we can make a difference. King Christian met the moment through his courage. And it wasn't just riding horseback, although it took courage to do it. It was the resolve necessary we hear the Star of David. And in the people, Jews, in their basements, in their churches, to ferry them to freedom, as Howard has described, and Leo can personally attest. To take across that narrow body of water to a place where they would be safe, encouraging them to act and seize that moment, because look the other way, as many did across Europe, and many rulers did at the time. All of us, I think, can, in a sense, feel the importance of those acts of courage, because all of us today here, I think, share the history, share the stories. My story, as you know, of my father coming to this country in 1935, only a few years before the events that we're recounting today. Not much more than the shirt on his back, speaking no English, knowing no one. And when he left Germany, the first place that he went was Sweden, to Stockholm, on his way to America. Twine. And in some sense, we are all here today. I am here today because America offered freedom, because there were people of righteous and humane state of mind willing to do what King Christian did, to stand up, to speak out, to seize the moment. And so I'm very, very honored to be here today, to share this occasion with you, to be with an extraordinary distinguished diplomat representing the people of Denmark, Helle Meinertz, who has a history herself of working in places where freedom is threatened. She served in China, for example, as the deputy head of mission on behalf of Denmark, and to present to her a certificate of special recognition on behalf of the Senate of the United States. And I hope Leo will join me here.
Leo, I know that you warned me that you might be too emotional for words, but just as a quick introduction, Leo Goldberger is of psychology at NYU. He was 14 years old, as you heard, when he was ferried with his family to safety in Sweden. Professor Goldberger is the author of a groundbreaking work on sensory deprivation and stress. He's also the author of the acclaimed volume, The Rescue of the Danish Jews, Moral Courage Under Stress, which can still be obtained online. In addition, he was awarded... NYU Press. Yes, that's my alma mater, by the way. Professor Goldberger was awarded the Order of Dannebrog, you'll pronounce that better than I will, Ambassador, Dannebrog, by Queen Margaret II of Denmark for his work in promoting communication between Danish and American professors. And so it gives us such extreme pleasure to introduce my new friend, Arya Leib, Professor Leo Goldberger. And again, you warned me that you might be too emotional for words, but what do you want to say a couple of words from your heart?
No, I must admit, at my age, which happens to be 95, my my immediate memory is poor. It just happened last year. My past memory is fantastic. I can remember escaping the Germans, and I just don't remember where I was yesterday. But one of the things I wanted to make sure to mention, the name of the capital city is Copenhagen. We hate Copenhagen. Am I right?
Okay. I see.
I don't know. I'm sorry to correct
That's
you.
fine, that's fine.
No, it is amazing that Americans like to call it Copenhagen for reasons that are very peculiar. It's to show off that they know the original, but it's not the right one.
Do you remember anything of that on that boat ride to Sweden?
Let me say that I remember being in the bushes near Copenhagen on a beach, waiting for a boat to come and to tell us with a signal that we could come, but we didn't realize we had to go up until here. So you can realize maybe my 3 little brothers, they had to be carried, and my mother, who was very short, her dress got all wet and so on, and we got onto the boat, and it left the harbor area. It was on the beach, and then in the middle, the Danish fisherman said he couldn't go further because they would be interned by the Swedish, in the Swedish side. So we had to be on the water, going up and down for a couple of hours, even though Copenhagen is quite near Malmö, which is where we headed for. In any case, as I was going through this, I kept thinking, what in the world did I ever do to deserve this? I didn't mention my parents because they were suffering. But I thought to myself, what the hell is going on? I have never done anything. The only thing I wanted to also mention is when the horse that carried our king passed our building, a sound from another car caused his falling on the ground. And I was on my way to school, and I remember him lying on the asphalt. And it was a very sad perception that I will never forget. I remember everything, and I think we're so grateful to the Danes, and I'm so pleased that the Danish ambassador is here. And I wish you lots of luck on your new job in New York. Yes. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Fantastic. Okay, I'll go. Leo, come on. All right, you're going to present it now. Come back. Okay, you're on, Senator. Does she want to speak first? She wants to speak after. She'll speak after this. You want to read that? You should read that. Okay, let's read it. You'll read that, right? Come. Stay right there.
I'm very honored to present this certificate of special recognition in memory of King Christian X, to the ambassador in honor of his embodying the spirit of the Danish people who resisted Nazi occupation and rescued Denmark's Jewish community. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
She's going to speak.
Thank you so much, Senator Blumenthal. Thank you, Rabbi Wainhouse. Thank you, Professor Goldberger. We spoke Danish together. Mr. Goldberger speaks very well Danish. Mr. Weiss. Thank you to the congregation Or Shalom, and thank you to the Jewish Federation of Greater New Haven. It's a great honor to be here today, and on behalf of the Royal House of Denmark and the Danish people, to receive this certificate on their behalf. The Jewish community has been an important part of our country for more than 400 years. Since His Majesty King Christian IV formally invited Jewish families to settle there in the 1600s. Therefore, the atrocities during World War II continue to move the Danes deeply. The Holocaust is a crime against humanity, never to be repeated and never to be forgotten. Last year marked the 80 years had passed since the majority of Jews in Denmark escaped a Nazi-led roundup and planned deportation. During this time, as already mentioned, many Danes chose to put their lives in danger, to do what is right, and to help their Jewish countrymen escape to safety in Sweden. Today, we can all be proud of the Jewish people, of the Danes that stood up for them, and the Danish king, His Majesty King Christian X, who was a known supporter of the Jewish community. Since arriving in New York, I have continuously been met by immense gratitude from Americans toward the Danes and Swedes that had the courage to act during World War II. Reflecting on the past and on the value of solidarity and civic courage is crucial. I'm honored to be part of the commemoration here today. Thank you, a heartfelt thank you from me, the Royal House, and the Danish people. Af hjertet tak. I only have one hand.
Thank you, Ambassador, and we wish you a full healing. The ambassador had, I think, were you skating at Rockefeller Center, or where were you skating? When you, yes, that's not for the last time, she says. It's a great skating rink. At any rate, friends, the richness of this morning's program, unfortunately, did not allow enough time for any meaningful question and answer period. Please, however, consider sending your questions, and look at the handout, it'll tell you, look at the very last item in the handout. Send your questions to rabbi@orshalomct.org, rabbi@orshalomct.org, and I'll be glad to direct your questions to the appropriate speaker and then convey their answer to you. Thank you all for coming. At this time, it gives me great pleasure to call upon the president of Mystic Seaport, Mr. Peter Armstrong.
Thank you. I will be incredibly brief because I know time is against us, but my brief thing to say is that Girder 3 needs your help. We've talked a lot about this vessel. the vessel, I like to think that ships are called vessels because they hold stories. And at the moment, Gerda 3 is one of our most heavily visited exhibits. You've learned all today about the story, but imagine that many, many people do not know this story. And every single day we tell that story. And I would particularly, like to thank, the rabbi. I'd like to thank the senator. I'd like to thank the professor. I'd like to thank the ambassador. But particularly, I'd like to thank the shipkeeper who keeps this ship afloat for us. But, if you take something as precious as an object like the Gerda 3 that we have to look after in perpetuity forever, and then you put it in the water, things happen. Thank you. So you can see what you're looking at here is the very hold that the Jewish people were saved in, that were put into, that were carried across. And this is the kind of condition that this boat is now, unfortunately, falling into. So she needs your help, and I'm just really here to say, at the moment, we need to take her out of the water because she's just in such bad condition. As we lift her out of the water, we have to remove the engine because if we don't remove the engine, it'll just go through the hull because of the water's holding it up. So it's in really particularly bad condition. I mean, you can see, right? So it's in particularly bad condition at this point in time. It's just 100 years old. It just needs help and needs support. So as a non-profit, we often ask people to support our causes. The boat actually belongs to the Jewish Heritage Museum, but we look after it, and we're not going to let it suffer. We're going to make sure that it is used. So what we're going to do is lift it out of the water, put it onto the dry land where we can do the work, but we do need financial support for that. So I'd ask you to say, Gerda 3 was there to give hope to those Jews in Copenhagen, and it really needs your help now. So on your way out, you'll see a leaflet with a little bit of a story. It'll also on there's a QR code that'll tell you how you can help us financially, and there's also an envelope which is prepaid if you wish to help it. All that money will go in towards a Gerda 3. Our trustees have already pledged nearly $200,000 towards doing this as well. So if you can help anybody in this room, that would be a most beneficial. Thank you very much.
Peter, a question. A question was asked, will the boat be visitable
Yes.
when it's being restored?
Yes, so I don't know if you've got, can you just click another click, is that right? Sure. There, okay, so we're planning to just build one of these and put it on the land, put the boat on the land and allow people to visit and see it because, we have many boats. I've got 800 boats in Mystic Seaport, right? It's the largest maritime museum in America. We have many boats. This is probably the most important story of any of the boats that we have. We're not going to let that story go. So yes, people will be able to visit on the land and to see and to hear that story as we go along as well. So it'll always be invisible, and during my presidency, it will always be the most important boat that we have. Thank you.
Thank you. Fantastic. Thank you so much. Gary Michelson, please come forward, president of our congregation.
I just have a few very brief closing remarks. First of all, I've been coming here also. I've been a member for 20 plus years and coming to all 18 of these. And every year, I think you probably share my feelings, is that I feel myself in awe of the program and what we learned. And it always strikes me that it's not, this isn't just, words you're reading in a history book or a movie or a documentary. This is real life. And especially, you see the emotion to see someone like, Mr. Goldberger who lived through it. I don't know how, you can't be moved. And, like they said at the beginning of this ceremony today, reminds us to never forget. But I did want to thank everyone who made this possible today. Certainly our distinguished guests, for some of you who traveled far and taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us today to make this such a wonderful program. I'd also like to thank the Or Shalom Men's Club, the Yellow Candle Fund that you heard about earlier today from our chairman, Mitch Goldblatt, who helped fund this, as well as a number of other programs that support Holocaust remembrance. I'd like to thank the Jewish Federation of Greater New Haven, who have been our partners in partner in these programs over the years. I'd like to thank the Selman family and Mr. Jimmy Shore for your generous support in helping defer some of the costs to put on this program today. Our Adult Education Committee, chaired by Sarah Dara, who unfortunately can't be here today, but all the work that they did to help coordinate and make this program run so smoothly. And certainly, last but certainly not least, a big thank you to Rabbi Wainhouse. You know, I mean, this, as you can tell, has been his passion project. I mean, the whole program today was really conceived. It was his idea, but you know, he's just been the driving force behind this. You know, the energy, enthusiasm that he brings to this, you know, obviously can be felt, and it resonates throughout the whole program today. I will say, if you enjoyed today's program, as I said, you might want to consider making a donation, as we just heard, to the Mystic Seaport Museum, Goethe III restoration. And again, as you heard, I believe there are envelopes in the lobby to make that donation and much needed repair. Again, as I said, I'd like to thank the Men's Club Yellow Candle Program, Jewish Federation of Greater New Haven, and of course, our own synagogue congregation, Or Shalom, and all of our staff here. And I'd also like to give a shout out to our security team, as well as the Orange Police Department. Thank you so much for the work that they do. Yeah. You know, it's a sad reality, but it's the world we live in. But, you know, I think still us being here and showing up shows that, you know, we're going to win. And we thank the people, the security people who help us, you know, keeping us safe. I just want to also mention, for those of you who are here today, in the back of the room, our fundraising committee is selling flameless yahrzeit candles. They're $8. They have an LED, and it's a wonderful, it's an important fundraiser for us. But it's also a great little product, especially for those that are living in places where you might not be able to have a flames, maybe an assisted living facility. So if you'd be so inclined, they're in the back of the room. Over here to my right, your left. So with that, I would, again, thank everyone so much for your attendance today. Being together means a lot. It's all about community. I want to wish you all a very happy Thanksgiving. And to end today's event, I would ask you to please all rise if you are able, and join us in the singing of God Bless America, led by our cantoral soloist, Brendan Cassidy.
Just want to add one thought. Eric Severs, where are you? Thank you so much, Eric. Where's Eric? Thank you so much for all of your tech support. It was tremendously important. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I hope you will please join me in singing as well. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above. From the mountains to the prairies, to the oceans, white with foam. God bless America, my home, sweet home. God bless America, my home, sweet home.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.